it water with the sheep in the box?
I know it's a hard pill to swallow and it's not really representative of the reality, but the fact of the matter is that right now the right have essentially laid claim to the concept of free speech and the First Amendment over in the US, essentially without consequence, despite the fact that, let's be honest here, they're usually the first to start talking about taking freedom of speech away if someone they dislike is using it in ways they disapprove of, at least in the West. I think it's important to discuss how and why this happened, and crucially, why we should do our best to reverse this trend, because it's pretty self-evidently untrue. Freedom of speech is, and always has been, a radically left-wing and anti-authoritarian ideal, and has always been opposed and crushed by right-wing organisations and groups. Just take a look at the way the US government, and groups aligned with it, managed to utilise its immense power to eliminate people who are using their freedom of speech wrong, almost without repercussion. Civil rights leaders in the 60s leap to mind, as does the murder of people like Harvey Milk, along with a number of other civil rights activists across the world, silenced and slandered by authoritarian regimes, usually right-wing, for the crime of using their freedom of speech wrong. And let's not forget the silencing of black voices the Klan is responsible for, as well as the British-backed apartheid government of South Africa, or the union organisers throughout history who have been murdered by hired thugs under the employ of the corporations they're trying to resist. Freedom of speech is an issue fundamental to left-wing philosophy, at least if you're actually going to support left-wing ideas and not some kind of state capitalist oligarchy or unholy hybrid of capitalism and socialism that people on Twitter can tell you is actually much better than Western democracy if you ignore all the genocide. Anyway, let's talk about free speech, why we should stop using that dumb meme already, and why your conservative uncle who tells you that the left actually want to take yours away so that they can forcibly feminize all men and put them in gulags for daring to resist the postmodern neo-Marxist takeover of the West is wrong on just about every fundamental level.
Cancel culture runs the world now, the planet went crazy. Label everything we say as homophobic or racist. If you're white, then you're privileged, guilty by association. All our childhood heroes got me too'd or they're rapists.
Okay, let's get one thing out of the way right off the bat. The right have managed to centre free speech as one of their primary platforms and have been complaining about their free speech being taken away when private universities decide not to host them or pay them to give a talk to their students. But do they actually care about freedom of speech any more than they care about individual liberty, whilst advocating for erosion of civil liberties and expansion of migrant detention camps in the prison industrial complex, continuing to exacerbate mass incarceration? They certainly claim to, but let's examine the evidence. To those paying close attention, it can often seem like conservatives believe it's more important that they be able to say the N-word, harass trans people, or accost random women on the street than, actual free speech issues. Just take a look at most of the free speech concerns those on the right seem to care the most about. It appears to mostly just be weird shit about cancel culture and deplatforming rather than legitimate examples of infringements or restrictions upon free expression, right? Look, don't get me wrong, those are interesting topics to discuss, and we can certainly have a conversation about what it means that public figures must now be held accountable for dumb things they said on the internet a decade ago, or whether or not we should trust private platforms, which basically have a monopoly online like YouTube or Twitter, to police what is and isn't acceptable speech. But that's more abstract and getting into the philosophy of what counts as free speech, and before we can really tackle subjects like that, we first need to investigate why it is that the so-called free speech absolutists don't seem to really care about real, serious free speech issues when they personally are not affected. A prime example of this apparent hypocrisy is the overwhelming right-wing support for the recent police crime sentencing and courts bill that's being pushed through the House of Commons in the UK right now, and which we'll talk about in a moment, as well as more in depth in a future video. But in order to really understand it, we need to really discuss the importance of protest in general. This bill is particularly terrifying primarily because it basically criminalises peaceful protest, but to a certain extent that was already informally the case. Any over-policing or heavy-handed dealings with the police at protests is, in a sense, a clear and direct attack on our freedom of expression. If the police respond to peaceful protests with violence, intimidation and military-grade weaponry, weaponry, as we're seeing in Bristol right now, then that's a clear indication that they intend to crush that protest because it's inconvenient or in some way offensive. After all, you only bring riot shields and gas masks if you're expecting a riot or to be using gas. But prior to this bill, it was at least something that could be pursued legally or at least pushed back against by activists. This new legislation is bad, like really bad, but it only formalizes what we've already seen in the US and UK recently, and that is terrifying. You can only protest what those in power want you to protest now, and you can only protest the way they want you to as well, at which point, why even bother? Safer to stay home and not protest injustice than to fight back and be thrown in jail for a decade, eh? Usually it's not all that explicit, but generally the people in power don't like to be questioned or challenged by the public, mostly because challenging or questioning authority is how progressive change happens. Civil rights protesters were brutalized and imprisoned for exercising their rights, as were gay men in the 70s and 80s, during a time where there was a law that literally made it illegal to talk about gays in a classroom. Gay publications were often considered obscene and banned under laws intended to protect children from seeing offensive materials, and this continues to today, with episodes of kids shows in which cartoon rats get gay married have literally started being censored by American TV networks to protect the children. But what about this cancel culture we've heard so much about? Well,
can you lose your job for free thought? Will you have your speech policed at every angle, every aspect, every walk of society? Increasingly, you know the answer to that is yes in America.
Liberals need a stand your ground law for cancel culture, so that when the woke mob comes after you for some ridiculous offense, you'll stand your ground. Stop apologizing, because I can't keep up anymore with who's on the list. Cancel culture is real, it's insane, and it's growing exponentially, and it's coming to a neighborhood near you. And mature people understand humans are continually evolving, as opposed to Wokeville, where they're always shocked we didn't emerge enlightened from the primordial ooze. Memo to social justice warriors: when what you're doing sounds like an Onion headline, stop.
Joining me for the second day in a row is a man who many have tried to cancel, but no one has climbed that hill yet. Well, I have to tell you, I absolutely love your new book. And I wanted to get into the part of it today that talks about cancel culture. And you say cancel culture, as it's become known, is one of the very worst things about modern society. And it's driven by the same woke liberals who profess to stand for tolerance. That's from page 60. This is a very vocal minority that's really kind of a bunch of bullies.
The worst case of cancel culture that I've seen in recent memory. This is amazing.
Just getting texts in the break from friends who live in Washington, D.C., where I spent 30 years, people being shot all over the city, totally third world place, people living on the streets by the thousands. Do any members of Congress who are worried about QAnon notice this? Does Michael McCall notice this? What is happening to our capital city? They're allowing it to happen. Nothing's more infuriating than that, except maybe what's happening to Dr. Seuss.
For many of these self-styled free speech warriors of the right, the goal isn't necessarily actually achieving true freedom of speech, but more concern is paid to the aesthetics of free speech and how good it feels to be able to say you're fighting for basic rights like that. It's a sort of righteousness the left gets to enjoy when it comes to, for example, civil rights issues, where the right often find themselves on the opposite end of that conflict. Why do I say this? Well, because generally it's the left who have been fighting for actual free speech causes, and the right who have been mostly focused on cancel culture, which is often positioned directly opposite free speech and used to make some kind of deranged point about how the left actually hate free speech or some shit. But it seems to work, and actually makes the right seem like they have principles for once, which I'm sure is nice for them. So, what is cancel culture? Well, to describe it in the most basic possible terms, it's people on the internet receiving criticism, justified or not, for things they've said and done by other people on the internet and corporations either pandering to more liberal demographics and or folding to public pressure when it comes to social issues. A few examples of this are Mr. Potato Head, which these people claim was cancelled when the company who produces them slightly changed the branding from Mr. Potato Head to Potato Head for the whole line of toys, even though you can still buy Mr. Potato Head toys along with Mrs. Potato Head and so on. Or how about Dr. Seuss, who was apparently cancelled because a few of his old books with outdated racial stereotypes weren't going to to be printed anymore. Or there's Gina Carano, who was cancelled because she posted a bunch of unprofessional, potentially offensive shit on her public Twitter account after multiple warnings. And Disney, you know, the cartoon people, whose founder was an infamous anti-Semite, which they've tried desperately to try to get people to forget, decided that maybe they don't want people to associate Holocaust revisionism with their brand. And on the list goes. Every single time this cancel culture shit is thrown around, and it inevitably turns out that it was either a company making a decision to get viral publicity out of these absolutely unhinged weirdos making their brand trend, or else improve perception of their brand by pretending to give a shit about some social issue or other, but not in a way that would actually help. Or it was some people on Twitter being upset about something, and most of the time it's all of the above, or some combination thereof. In other words, it's the free market and free speech in action, but somehow that's a bad thing now. I say this because every single right-wing person has a whole pre-packaged rant about cancel culture that they like to whip out every possible opportunity these days, like John Barrowman's penis, and it's always bullshit, but it works because they have successfully claimed the aesthetic high ground when it comes to freedom of speech. They go to bat for a Star Wars actress getting fired for being anti-Semitic, but will harass another Star Wars actress mercilessly to the point where they silence her, or at least partially, for the crimes of being Asian and also playing a character they didn't like, and attempt to organise boycotts of Disney products in an attempt to pressure them into no longer putting SJW politics into their products, but somehow that's not cancel culture. Notice, by the way, that the focus here is not on, for example, using Carano's example to push for strengthening workers' rights or abolition of at-will employment laws or legislation that allows employers to fire workers without justification, because in their minds, firing someone for trying to form a trade union is a-okay, but being fired for publicly posting COVID conspiracy memes and Holocaust revisionism on your public Twitter, the same one that you promote your Disney-affiliated products, is unforgivable cancel culture in action somehow. And yet, when it comes to repression of free speech in the legal system, it's usually the left who are the victims, and 9 times out of 10, the ones pushing back against it, with 1 or 2 exceptions, which I'll talk about right now, because usually at this point in the conversation, some rightoid dipshit will bring them up either way.
Do I gas the Jews? Do I gas the Jews? Do I gas the Jews? Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
So this whole situation was fucking dumb. For those of you who don't know, Count Dankula is a conservative shitposter who taught his dog to do a Nazi salute whenever he said shit like "gas the Jews," and as a result was prosecuted under British law. Look, I know I might get a little pushback for this, but in my opinion, this was a disgusting miscarriage of justice, and despite the fact that he's an absolute bellend who, outside of this incident, is most famous for giggling like a moron while Sargon of Akkad shouted that a Labour MP was a bitch after being asked about that one time he said he wouldn't even rape her by a journalist.
Unlike the establishment, unlike our judges who literally say if you were a man I would have sent you to jail, I think we should treat women the same as men. And that means if a woman is being a giant and laughing at male suicide, I'm going to be a giant back to her. Any questions?
I completely reject the court's decision here. The issue is that he technically did break the law, at least arguably, which states a person is guilty of an offence if he A. sends by means of public electronic communications network a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene or menacing character, or B. causes any such message or matter to be so sent. The main thing to point out is that the law is too vaguely worded and up to too much interpretation. The law, as far as I'm aware, basically exists to curb online harassment, stalking, abuse and so on, by making things like this illegal. However, in this case it was also applied to a dumb YouTube video made in extremely poor taste, where realistically it shouldn't have been. The problem with laws like this, as well as archaic blasphemy laws, is that they leave too much up to interpretation and don't account for changes in things like internet discourse, and that's never a good thing. In this case, it leaves the question of what is grossly offensive open to interpretation, and I guess saying shit like Sieg Heil and gas the Jews whilst giggling like a maniac could be interpreted in that way, but so could a lot of other things depending on who you ask, and crucially, depending on the context. Frank discussion of trans people and their issues, for example, could be considered grossly offensive to a transphobe, or discussions of gay sex or sex toys or interracial marriage or whatever could be interpreted as grossly offensive by a judge who was homophobic or racist, and so on. So the law cannot and and should not be dependent on the opinion or political views of the person presiding over a case. Otherwise, what's even the point of the legal system in the first place? Might as well just flip a coin. However, with all that said, I will concede that unlike the police and crime bill that's got everyone upset now, the maximum sentence for breaking the Communications Act is 6 months in prison, and I think Dankula actually got off with an £800 fine in the end, which was more than covered by the massively successful fundraising effort he received. But the fact and the principle is that laws like this are unacceptable and need to be repealed or amended to facilitate true freedom of speech. This is actually just the online version of the 1994 Public Order Act, which states 1. A person is guilty of an offence if, with intent to cause a person harassment, alarm or distress, he A. uses threatening, abusive or insulting words or behaviour or disorderly behaviour, or B. displays any writing, sign or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive or insulting, thereby causing that or another person harassment, alarm or distress. 2. An offence under this section may be committed in a public or private place, except that no offence is committed where the words or behaviour are used or the writing, sign or other visible representation is displayed by a person inside a dwelling and the person who is harassed, alarmed or distressed is also inside that or another dwelling. 3. It is a defence for the accused to prove A. that he was inside a dwelling and had no reason to believe that the words or behaviour used or the writing, sign or other visible representation displayed would be heard or seen by a person outside that or any other dwelling, or B. that his conduct was reasonable. 4. A constable may arrest without warrant anyone who reasonably suspects is committing an offence under this section. Now, I think we can all agree that harassing, abusing, threatening someone is never acceptable, and I can see where there may be some leeway as to what counts as abusive, but again, the problem here is offence, which is largely subjective. Also, we need to remember that Count Dankula was not the first nor the last person to be caught up in this shit. In fact, as I recall, recently, a Scottish man was arrested under it after posing a dumb tweet about an old man who raised money for the NHS due to it being underfunded by consecutive Tory governments. But because that old man was seen as a kind of national hero, it was deemed grossly offensive.
Bill C-16 purported to do nothing but extend human rights provisions to an excluded group, let's say, to the transgender and non-gender binary types, and that was the federal legislation. It also made it a hate crime to discriminate or harass, essentially.
On the other end of the scale, you have everyone's favourite racist grandpa, who failed to follow his own rules for life so spectacularly that after openly saying that he wouldn't trust anyone who smokes weed, he ended up in a coma in a Russian hospital because he refused to listen to Canadian doctors who told him that going cold turkey on prescription painkillers was a really dumb idea, and his rise to fame on the back of his opposition to Canadian Bill C-16, which he claimed would put people in prison for accidentally misgendering trans kids, when in reality all it did was add trans people to a list of protected groups in a law that already existed in Canada at the time and had done since 1977, making it illegal to deny services, employment, accommodation and so on to anyone based on their gender identity or gender expression alone. As of yet, literally nobody has been prosecuted or jailed under C-16, and the law itself only states that if found in breach there may be a fine to be allocated to the affected party, but no jail time. In fact, as the Library of Parliament in Canada summarised it, the bill is intended to protect individuals from discrimination within the sphere of federal jurisdiction and from being the targets of hate propaganda as a consequence of their gender identity or their gender expression. The bill adds gender identity or expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act and the list of characteristics of identifiable groups protected from hate propaganda in the Criminal Code. It also adds that evidence that an offence was motivated by bias, prejudice or hate based on a person's gender identity or expression constitutes an aggravating circumstance for a court to consider when imposing a criminal sentence. No, Jordan, a dude who is arrested for potential child abuse and dodging court orders as well as breaking C-16 isn't an example of you being vindicated if he was arrested on suspicion of those other things first. If I don't pay my TV licence and also kill someone, me being arrested isn't proof that the BBC have sent the fuzz after me, you dumb motherfucker.
Cancel culture runs the world now, the planet went crazy. Label everything we say as homophobic or racist. If you're white, then you're privileged, guilty by association. All our childhood heroes got me too'd or they're raping.
Yeah boy, we've got the pretentious subtitle in the middle. Fuck yeah. Well, you know what kind of video this is, and it's me making it, so let's spend a while complaining about capitalism, shall we?
Woke up this morning, some students deplatformed me. Woke up this morning, some campus disinvited me.
Here's an interesting question. Is access to social media a human right, and should it be? Well, this all stems from the idea of deplatforming, right? The idea of taking someone's platform away so they can no longer spread hateful or harmful ideas. This is really pretty straightforward when it comes to, for example, something like giving a talk or being invited by a university or other organisation to speak at some kind of guest lecture thing. The right called it deplatforming when people like Milo Yiannopoulos had events cancelled by universities after students and staff complained, but I think it's pretty safe to say that no one has an automatic right to a multi-million-dollar speaking tour, and that if a university changes its mind about the sort of people they want to invite onto campus to give a talk, they're perfectly within their rights to do so, and if they really want to, then I guess they can just go set up their own talk somewhere else, or do a Roy Chubby Brown and spend their lives doing gigs in conservative clubs to slowly fewer and fewer people until they die sad, racist and alone. But the problem with places like Twitter or YouTube is that they're often the only game in town. There's a lot to be said about the importance of sites like Twitter in organising politically and socially, and for reporting from places where maybe censorship is more egregious and traditional journalism can't be carried out in the same way. Connecting to social media can be a good way of getting your story out there. However, the problem is that if you get banned from YouTube, where else are you going to go? BitChute, if you're an extreme far-right agitator maybe, but I can't see anyone left of Margaret Thatcher being welcomed over there or even having a pleasant experience themselves. But this is the problem with social media platforms. Inevitably, they form a pseudo-monopoly, since if the fun of a social media site is the people, then obviously you go to the most popular one, and the others die by the wayside as they can't compete. I mean, let's say you started a YouTube competitor right now. Unless you can compete with the sheer volume of content and audience, you're never going to get anywhere, because honestly, why would anyone go to a site that has comparatively fewer videos, and what content creator is going to want to leave YouTube for your platform if the viewership isn't there to support them through things like ads? And if none of the creators you love are on the platform, or at least exclusively on the platform, why bother going there, and so on and so forth. The point here being, considering how much of our lives nowadays are dictated by social media, should access to a social media account be considered a human right? I would say probably not. And of course, any site that refuses to ban users is going to be a nightmare to use basically immediately, but that doesn't mean that being shut out from the conversation completely is an acceptable course of action when it comes to controversial people either. But, I hear you say, that's what TOS and site moderation is for, right?
I'm being silenced. I'm gonna go and say so on the news. It's like Stalin. I'll say it in all my interviews.
Something we on the left have a habit of doing when it comes to free speech is pointing out that when people get banned from Twitter or whatever, they shouldn't complain because, hey, it was the free market that made that decision, right? Aren't the right supposed to be big fans of the free market? And anyway, nobody has an automatic right to a Twitter account, right? The problem there is that, yes, technically it's not some kind of legal attack on the right to free expression, but at the same time, we must remember that online, speech is both freer and more restricted than it has ever been. See, it's now easier for you to get your voice out there and make yourself heard than ever before. If you want, you can at a celebrity and call them a shithead, which, I mean, how often would you get to do that before? Or you can start a YouTube channel, and if you're lucky, you can reach millions of people and seriously influence online discourse in unprecedented ways. In a sense, our media has become more accessible and democratized. However, at the same time, the nature of the internet and the way people prefer their content to all be in one convenient place, as just mentioned, monopolies started forming basically everywhere there was a need. Specifically for our purposes today, Twitter, Facebook and YouTube fulfill a purpose, and no competitor can even exist without immediately being either crushed or bought by them. WhatsApp, Snapchat and Messenger used to be competitors until Facebook bought them out, and now unless you want to text using SMS like some kind of fucking dinosaur, you functionally have no real choice but to use at least one of Facebook's products. The same is true of Twitter and YouTube. Other similar sites crop up from time to time, but eventually they all just get crushed into the dirt. I mean, really, who uses Vimeo other than weird film nerds? Or BitChute outside of people who already got banned from YouTube? There are a few places with subscription models, but that's not really going to threaten YouTube now, is it? Here's the thing. These These places are both the only game in town and run by private companies that place profit and reputation over principle and can impose their rules on you regardless of your feelings on freedom of speech or even local laws regarding it. The company is accountable to no one but their shareholders and doesn't actually have to enforce its TOS outside of abiding by local laws, like for example banning Nazi imagery in Germany. So what if someone repeatedly and flagrantly breaks the TOS but makes a lot of money for the company? Well, who's going to hold YouTube accountable if they turn a blind eye to certain controversial figures on their platform if their videos rake in engagement? On the other hand, if you are unjustly banned from one of these platforms, if you in fact didn't break the rules, but YouTube doesn't choose to reverse its decision, you basically have no choice but to start over, even if you did nothing wrong. So long as it's not illegal and no viable alternative arises, what possible repercussions will YouTube face if they don't apply their rules consistently? But even these cases are pretty arbitrary, to be honest. The real point to be made isn't that the rules are unjustly or inconsistently applied, which they are, but that these rules must be abided by in the first place. For example, you're unable to do and say certain things on YouTube or Twitter that would be perfectly legal for you to do or say in a public space, and likewise, there are some things you can say or do on these platforms that you simply cannot in real life. This kind of makes sense from one perspective because, well, they're totally different contexts, but at least the laws of the land are in theory agreed upon by elected officials and the people can have at least some say in them. YouTube, on the other hand, is not a democracy of any kind and their decision is final. The point I'm making here is this: why should the rules of a private corporation be more powerful in some sense than the actual law? It's all well and good saying, well, it's a private entity, they can do what they want, if you don't like it, go elsewhere. But with YouTube and Twitter, there is no elsewhere to go. In order to be included in the conversation, you basically have to agree to a bunch of arbitrary rules set out by a billion-dollar corporation, and also they might just choose not to apply them if it means that they might lose money. This isn't to say that people getting banned from Twitter or YouTube for particularly extremist content isn't necessarily good, because it definitely helps stop the spread of dangerous ideas, but the problem is, well, who gets to decide what counts as a dangerous idea? If it's a powerful megacorporation like Google, lefties might want to reconsider trusting them with being the sole arbiter of what speech is acceptable, and especially being the ones to make decisions on whose ideas are too extreme to deserve a platform, because, well, who's to say anti-capitalism won't eventually find itself on that list? For a corporation that only exists because of capitalism, it's certainly a possibility. Am I saying that we should nationalize social media? Well, no, not really, because honestly, state-run social media probably wouldn't be much better, especially since the government has its own fucked up ideas of what constitutes a dangerous or extreme ideology, but it definitely shouldn't be the case that a single entity has a monopoly on forms of online speech. I've heard a few interesting suggestions regarding democratized platforms and introducing some kind of jury of random users to make decisions regarding bannings and things like that, and even some kind of YouTube union to help protect unjustly persecuted users, all of which sound promising, and I look forward to seeing how this conversation progresses.
Cancel culture runs the world now, the planet went crazy. Label everything we say as homophobic or racist. If you're white, then you're privileged, guilty by association. All our childhood heroes got me too'd or they're rapists.
Like it or not, the right to free speech and freedom of expression is essential to a fully functioning and free society. Sure, we may not actually be that free, or as free as we may like. We may still have prisons at overcapacity because we refuse to listen to evidence that mass incarceration does not in fact work, and we may be essentially restricted by the controlling influence of neoliberal capitalism, but the most fundamental of all rights is that of freedom of speech, freedom to oppose, and freedom to resist those in power. We can do this through unions, by protesting, by organising mass movements, most of which is facilitated, or at least aided by, yes, utilising our freedom of speech. Sure, often the narrative is co-opted by the right, who want to be able to scream the N-word in a public space without repercussion and claim that anyone trying to stop them is restricting their free speech, but the fact of the matter is that no matter how much we mock them for it and how many times we post freeze peach memes, this stuff is incredibly important and we need to be able to discuss it and be honest with ourselves about why we push back so hard against these free speech absolutists, other than the fact that they are not in fact free speech absolutists and are lying for clout. Without protest, without the right to organise, without the right to speak out, without the right to distribute flyers, stickers, zines, books, etc., we would have struggled much more to have resisted power or pushed through any progressive steps throughout history. And we need to remember that and not be so quick to write off the right to free speech as a right-wing issue or something not worth discussing or foregone conclusion, in my opinion.
Cancel culture runs the world now, the planet went crazy. Label everything we say as homophobic or racist. If you're white, then you're privileged, guilty by association. All our childhood heroes got Me Too'd or they're rapists.
The thing with free speech is that, realistically, it's never truly free. The right might like to claim that actually it's the left who seek to restrict it with cancel culture and so on, but honestly, what is cancel culture if not the purest form of free speech? People using their speech to criticize others, using their free speech to say offensive stuff, seems like a pretty reasonable way to celebrate it, to be honest, but of course the right like to pretend to understand what freedom of speech is, whilst having no fucking idea what they're talking about. They'll celebrate when BLM are brutally repressed by agents of state violence, but won't take the obvious next logical step and admit that that's actually an example of their disdain for the freedom of speech for others they don't like. They'll mass report and bully people off Twitter, but when one of their favourite mediocre actors gets pushback for posting Holocaust revisionism on Twitter, that's a restriction on freedom of speech. Likewise, you have people supporting this new law criminalising protests and simultaneously claiming that laws prohibiting hate speech are disgusting infringements upon free speech. Of course, you also have dumb people on the left who claim that the law that Dankula was prosecuted under was justifiable, but that this law is unacceptable, and honestly, I think we just have to decide to come together and agree that both of these things are bad and that the law shouldn't really get involved with things like this, although I'll admit that it doesn't really help when people like Count Dankula, who fancy themselves warriors for free speech, spend most of their time smugly gesturing in the vague direction of an imagined hypocrisy rather than actually doing anything to help people resist this new affront to freedom of speech, which used to be something they claimed to care about before free speech stopped being an exclusively right-wing talking point. Threats, harassment, abuse, hate speech and so on are all terrible, obviously, and probably could do with some regulation, but I think that when it comes to stuff like offence or just being rude or whatever, we need to just allow people to be assholes from time to time. What the right don't seem to understand is that by taking the freedom of speech discussion to a non-legal, interpersonal place, they've opened themselves up to the same kind of criticism they levy at everyone else. Namely, if criticising and calling people out on the internet is cancel culture and an infringement of basic rights, then what about people who get fired for shit-talking their boss on social media? What about people who lose their jobs for the crime of organising a union or attending a union meeting? Random Twitter users can't very effectively inflict tangible harm on you beyond like mass flagging your Twitter account, I guess, but get caught bashing your employer online and they can and will fire you, potentially rendering you homeless or destitute. Likewise, it's not exactly an exclusively left-wing thing to call for boycotts or, well, basically the exact same shit from the opposite direction, and that's without getting into more subtle ways of silencing people, like, for example, creating an environment in which marginalised people feel unsafe and unable to open up and speak freely due to their tacit approval of some of the ideas espoused by guest speakers or popular verified accounts. Likewise, one could point to examples of reactionaries threatening to sue people who mildly criticise them on Twitter as a method of silencing people who either haven't got the time or money to fight a lengthy court battle for calling J.K. Rowling a transphobe, despite, the arguably transphobic things she's said and done, but that's a whole rabbit hole we don't really have time to find ourselves falling down, I think. Talk about cancel culture all you like, but the fact of the matter is that if you're going to start insisting that social media backlash is some kind of great affront to free speech, then so is capitalism and the power it has over our lives. Likewise, if a social media platform believed in free speech absolutism, no moderation whatsoever and no bannings, then all of a sudden we end up with the most extreme people taking over because they can't openly discuss their garbage ideas anywhere else, and there's no punishment to dissuade them from just spamming the N-word. Hence BitChute, Parler, Gab and so on. The main contradiction here is that if you want true free speech, then realistically you need to be anti-capitalist to at least some degree, or the very least accept that criticism is not silencing. See, the main things that cause cancelling, according to the right, are the free market and freedom of speech working as intended. If you don't like either of those things, then fine, but stop pretending that you do, Own up to either being an authoritarian or an anti-capitalist. Tell you what, when I can get on YouTube and call my employer out by name, the company, not my boss, and explain in depth the ways they've utterly fucked me, a disabled employee, over without repercussions, then I might give a fuck about some dipshit receiving justified criticism for saying a bunch of offensive shit on Twitter.
I could get 10 years for this, for bending all your ears with this, cause it's a fucking noisy song, which just things are fucking wrong, and it's illegal now to take the piss. The Tories found that ruling the nation was harder than their expectations, so it's simpler and more fun to just lock up everyone who expresses any reservations.
When the right claims to care about freedom of speech, in all likelihood they're lying or at the very least exaggerating. The right's idea of what free speech entails is often absolutely unhinged and totally detached from the actual issues of free speech. Most of the time it'll be cancel culture or some shit, which, let's be honest, isn't a real thing, and the only way to stop it happening is to restrict the rights of people online to criticise others, which doesn't seem like a great idea. Don't get me wrong, sometimes they'll accidentally stumble across a legitimate free speech issue, but as soon as it no longer benefits them to talk about it, that all goes out the window. When it comes to free speech online and the right to free speech in an online space, there's an interesting discussion to be had, but the right seem desperate to avoid having it. You see, the problem is capitalism, and breaking up internet pseudo-monopolies isn't something the right, or even libs, seem to really want to do. Free market and all that. Should we nationalise Twitter? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? Either way, the current way of doing things isn't working. Freedom of speech is an essential right, and one the left should care very much about. It's only with that right that we're able to openly discuss the problems with our system, and whilst, yes, there could probably be some restrictions on the kinds of free speech we allow in public, most of these should be social rather than legal, and it's important that we do our best not to allow these restrictions to impinge upon the right to free expression. If cancel culture exists because a company decided to rename Mr. Potato Head, but not when someone can be fired for union organising or being gay or trans or shit talking their boss online, then what even is it? What's more of a cancellation, being called out by people on the internet or losing your job? There are a lot of subtle ways in which speech can be affected or restricted, and it's important to explore them too, because if someone doesn't feel able to speak up because they feel unsafe, isn't that at least as much an infringement on their freedom of speech as someone being unable to post hate speech on Twitter? The right to freedom of speech is, and always has been, a left-wing ideal, and should remain that way. We cannot allow the right to lie and claim it, or their fucked up idea of it, for themselves, and crucially, we must wrest back control of the narrative, because right now, free speech is seen as a right-wing thing, and it shouldn't be. The right to free speech is so much more than the ability to say the N-word, and we must treat it that way.
Now I'm here on the web, and I'm seeing the tweets.
Hello everyone, it's been a while, hasn't it? I apologise for the long break in between videos, but I was moving house and I've also had a lot of stuff going on in my real life offline, so I'm afraid I wasn't really able to spend much time working on videos, but I'm back now, I'm settled into my new place and my personal stuff is manageable at the moment, and I'd like to thank you for your patience, especially my patrons, whose names are being displayed on screen right now, and who, if you want to join them, feel free to donate $1 or more to my Patreon. If you donate $2, I'll read out your name over the credits of every video, and if you donate $5 or more, you actually get behind the scenes fun little updates, so you get the video scripts for these once they're done, and you get video uploads usually a day or so early before they go live on YouTube as well. There's also a patrons only section of my Discord, which you can find in the description, but anyone can join that. You don't actually have to view the patrons only section, it's just available if you are a patron and you'd like to use it. Thanks for your patience everyone, and just before we go, I'd especially like to thank Elise the Mighty She-Beast, Aride, Bryden Beck, Chris Vagnacci, Deckard, Nanzakambe. Next we have Ryan, Brian, Pixels Green, Polite Pigeon, Stacey Solano, Susie M, The Bulk, Tom Newport, Arne Magnus Narang, and Orban. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you have a good one. Bye!